Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm going to assume that you can just hear me, and I'm going to forget the microphone to begin. Let me start by introducing myself. My name is Michael Gregory. I'm on the clinical faculty here at Harvard Law School. And we're just so grateful, A, to have the chance to participate in this bicentennial event, and B, that among the many amazingly interesting options you had for panels this morning, you chose to spend a few minutes with us. So thank you for being here. I want to start by sharing with you a little bit about our education law clinic here at Harvard Law School. And then after I give a brief overview, I'll let each of my colleagues here introduce themselves and tell you how they're connected to the clinic. Our clinic is very unique among education law clinics in the country in that we are connected to a nonprofit organization in Boston called Massachusetts Advocates for Children that many of you may have heard of. It's a nonprofit with a storied history of doing very innovative child advocacy work here in the Commonwealth. And we're fortunate to have our clinic be connected to MAC. The focus of the collaboration that our clinic represents is a project called the Trauma and Learning Policy Initiative. And hopefully by the end of our 90 minutes together, you'll understand what the connection is between the issue of childhood trauma and learning, children's learning at school. The mission of our project is to ensure that children who have been traumatized with exposure to violence and other adverse childhood experiences succeed in school. And as part of pursuing this mission, what we've come upon is a major social problem that you've probably heard of called the school-to-prison pipeline. We want to spend a little bit of time this morning sharing some more information about what that social problem is, how it's connected to the issue of traumatic experiences that kids might endure in childhood, and the work that our clinic is doing to tackle this problem. I want to briefly give an overview of the model of advocacy that we use in our clinic. The first thing that we do is we represent individual families. The students in our clinic provide direct representation to families whose children have had some form of traumatic experience and who also have disabilities that qualify them for special education under state and federal law. What we're looking at in our cases is what the interface is between the traumatic experiences that students have had and the learning and behavior challenges that they might be experiencing at school. In addition to our work with families, which is what the lawyers and law students on our project do, we also have non-lawyers on our team. We're an interdisciplinary team. And some of the non-lawyers, former educators, school psychologists, and social workers, work directly in schools, helping educators learn how to meet the needs of students who have experienced trauma, and in fact, all students. Then what we do, and this is something that our clinic students also help with, is we try to take the voices of the families that we represent, as well as the voices of the educators that we seek to support, and bring both sets of voices up to the policy level. In the spring semester, we offer a legislative lawyering clinic, in which our students learn how to take the insights that we're gaining from our cases and our work directly in schools and help legislators and those in the executive branch understand the resources and laws and regulations they need to put in place to help meet the needs of kids and help support the work of educators. That's what we do in our clinic. I had the good fortune of beginning my career with a Skadden Fellowship to help my colleague Susan Colt, who will introduce herself in a second, launched this clinic. Talk about being in the right place at the right time. I graduated in 2004 at the very moment this clinic was being started, and I haven't ever left. I've been at Harvard Law School ever since. I came to Harvard Law School with the desire to do education law work. I had a master's degree in teaching and encountered firsthand some of the systemic barriers that kids encounter at school, but came to law school because I wanted to gain a set of tools and a way of thinking that could help me address those problems in a systemic way. Each of us has a special connection to these issues, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues now and let them introduce themselves, and then we'll really get into the meat of the session this morning.
Christine. So I'm Susan Cole, and I'm really delighted to have you here to join us on the journey, our journey through the school-to-jail pipeline. As Mike said, I'm the director of the clinic and the Trauma and Learning Policy Initiative, which is the overarching partnership with Mass Advocates for Children and Harvard Law School. And we've been doing this about 14 years, and we have, worked our way through, through the policy, up toward the policy. My status is that I'm a lecturer at Harvard Law School and a project director at Mass Advocates for Children. So my job is to bring these two together, the real work in the field and the wonderful work that's going on in the academy. And it's been a wonderful experience. And we'd love to introduce two of our wonderful grads here.
My name's Seth Packrone, and I am a 2015 graduate of the law school. More importantly for today, I'm a 2013 participant of the Education Law Clinic. And I'm currently a staff attorney with an organization called Disability Rights Advocates, and we focus on impact and class action litigation for people with all types of disabilities, including educational disabilities, and working on the school-to-prison pipeline. I have been working in studying special education since I was a freshman in college. I grew up watching my niece, who has cerebral palsy, and my sister fight with the local school system to get her the appropriate services. And so when I got to college, I really wanted to work in this area. And before law school, I went and I got my master's in special education, and then came to law school, and I started to realize that all the kids I was advocating to get appropriate services were actually ending up in the criminal justice system. And that's really where my passion for the school-to-prison pipeline, for dismantling the school-to-prison pipeline, should be clear. There's not much diversity of opinion up here on that, but that's where that comes from. And so, since then, I've been focused on this intersection of disability and criminal justice.
Where are you based? Where are you based?
We're based in New York City.
And my name's Amanda Savage. I'm also a 2015 grad and a 2013 participant in the clinic. Right now, I'm a public defender in Essex County, New Jersey, which is Newark. But before law school, I got a master's in teaching, and I was a teacher for a period of time. So all of my interests kind of come together in the school-to-prison pipeline, really, although I do work with adults at this point.
So collectively, there's a set of questions that we want to explore with you in the next 80 or so minutes. The first of these questions is just to define a little bit more what the school-to-prison pipeline is. You may well have heard about it, but we want to deconstruct it a little bit, share some statistics and some information with you. Then we want to try to answer the question of what role do we see trauma as playing in the school discipline crisis? And this is what we've learned directly from our work with families and our work with educators. What is the role that trauma is playing? Third, we have a solution that we'd like to share with you to this crisis, and that is safe and supportive school environments that help children feel safe to learn, behave appropriately, and form effective relationships at school. So we want to share with you our ideas about this solution. And then finally, and really appropriately for a law school setting, we want to ask the question, if safe and supportive schools are a solution to the school-to-prison pipeline, what role does law and policy play in helping to bring that solution into being? So these are the 4 questions that we hope to discuss this morning. And if we do a good job, we'll leave some time at the end for you to ask some questions of us. Seth and Amanda?
Yeah, great. So like Mike was saying, first we want to start with sort of the definition of the problem so we're all on the same page. We borrowed this from the ACLU, so thank you to the ACLU.org. And it sort of says, it's the disturbing national trend of shifting students from public schools to the juvenile and adult criminal justice system. And it really is a situation where what these kids, there's an overrepresentation of these kids have some sort of mental health disability or a history of abuse. And what they actually need is more support, more educational services, more counseling. And what this problem does is actually shifts them to the opposite, where they become more isolated and they're actually punished for the behaviors that relate to their disabilities or relate to their history of trauma. We're going to talk more about the root causes and potential solutions, but what the problem actually does is it shifts what schools should be able to do in a system, an education system that should be equipped to handle these kids' complex needs, and shifts it to a prison system that clearly isn't set up to do that, and it just makes the problem worse.
So we have a slide with just some statistics about some various angles, starting with racial disparities in school arrests and juvenile arrests, and I don't think that should come as a surprise for anybody, because that's a truth of the criminal justice system in general. And the second statistic is about children who experience abuse and neglect as a child, and the impact that that has on them going forward, not just in an increased chance of being arrested as a juvenile, but also as an adult. So it's really a long-lasting effect on these children that are experiencing it at a young age. And we have a New York Times article that we printed out. It was in the Times a couple weeks ago, maybe last week, that really discusses that with one individual who experienced trauma as a child, and it discusses the trajectory of the rest of his life and how that led him into the criminal justice system and really never left him. And so, I see that in my work all the time. I work with adults. Some are practically juveniles, 18-year-olds. But even with my older clients, it's very easy to see, once you start digging deeper, how their experiences as children impact them for the rest of their lives. And a lot of my clients were either kicked out of school or left school when they first became involved with the criminal justice system, and that's an everlasting part of them, oftentimes.
And the statistics about disability in the criminal justice system are, I think, really shocking. 30 to 70% of kids involved with the criminal justice system have some sort of disability. If you have an emotional disability, you're 3 times more likely to be arrested before high school is over. And you might look at the 30 to 70% and say, well, that's a really wide range. And part of the reason the range is so high is because there's the systemic problem of schools not identifying behaviors that are actually a cause of a disability. So that's sort of why we have such a wide range. In my work at DRA, part of our focus is on dismantling the school to prison pipeline, but mostly focus on the prison part of it. And before I joined DRA, we had sued a juvenile detention center in California for their failure to provide special education services to kids under 18 and for placing kids in solitary confinement for behaviors related to their disability. And I think it will come as a surprise to no one that solitary confinement is a traumatic experience in and of itself and actually worsens these kids' disabilities. And now we are, in active litigation against the New Jersey Department of Corrections for the adult system in their failure to provide special education services to 18 to 21-year-olds who are in adult prison. And that also relates to their failure to take into account these young people's disabilities in taking punitive measures like administrative segregation or solitary confinement. For all of our clients have a disability, or they wouldn't be our client. But the other almost invariable thing that you see in their backgrounds is that from a young age, they experienced some sort of trauma and the school did not know how to respond to it. And so as a result, they've been pushed from the education system into the prison system, which just continually re-traumatizes them. And the root problem is never really addressed. I'll just share one quick story, and this actually isn't a current client, but this is someone I met a couple years ago through an internship. I met him when he was 15. He was attending school at a juvenile detention center. He had been in and out of prison for his young life. He's only 15. But his first arrest was in school for giving what I think we'd all here call a wedgie on the playground. And in most contexts, that is juvenile adolescent behavior. We can all agree he shouldn't have done it. But to arrest him and put him on the path in the criminal justice system, which is really tough to come back from, obviously was not the appropriate way to handle this kid's needs and set him on a trajectory that is really tough to correct when it could have been avoided early on.
Once you're in the criminal justice system, once you're arrested, no one is really looking at why your behavior happened. It's more about how do we punish you, what did you do, and not looking back at the explanation. And I think a lot is lost when you take a child from school and you react to their behavior by tossing them into a system that doesn't care really about why they acted in that way. I think you lose an opportunity to really try to help the child and to try to address the underlying cause of the behavior. And that's really lost when you send someone into the school to prison pipeline, as opposed to creating a school environment that can actually react and accommodate their needs. So we have a video that we're going to show that I think a lot of you may have already seen. It's very quick, but it really drives home how this happens, how a school can react very inappropriately to a situation and lose opportunities to react in a more productive way.
Okay. No, that's a very upsetting video to watch. This is a student who wouldn't give up her cell phone in a math class. She apparently had actually a good relationship with the teacher, but something we will never know because we don't know the details what's going on that day, and she didn't want to give up the cell phone. So they called in the police officer, they call it SRO.
School resource
School
officer.
resource, they call them school resource officers. They look like police officers to me, to deal with it instead of dealing with her like a young lady. What we do know a little bit was that she was in foster care. That's all we know. We may not need to know more to think about better ways to do this. So I'm going to take a little breather from having watched that. But, you know, we're in the state of Massachusetts, our clinic's in the state of Massachusetts. We've never had a call where a police officer's been called in to flip a student like that. That was pretty shocking. But we have been called in many, many times for suspensions and expulsions for very similar behavior. We had, starting in about 95, we had passed some of the most onerous school expulsion laws in the country here in Massachusetts. They've since been changed in 2014, but through that period of time, we suddenly got, I was as I mentioned, at Mass Advocates for Children as a staff attorney at the time, and we started getting a million calls. There was the butter knife case where the 5-year-old was suspended for having a butter knife because the knife you could be suspended for a knife. We had the child who, there was a fire drill and the child wouldn't move and he froze. And when the teacher pushed him to go ahead, he went like that. And then we get called in to represent him there. And what was interesting is, the children were admitting to doing these things. And so when you went in to represent, you try all your procedural issues, they don't work. And the law was allowing people to suspend, and expel for that. So as time went on, as we were fortunate to form this clinic, some of the cases we got were getting more and more, obviously upsetting, but very telling. We had, the 12-year-old who had been, well, he was now 14, but a 12-year-old had been expelled and had been out of school for 2 years. We get this child, he's been out of school for 2 years, and of course in and out of the juvenile justice system during that time. What are you going to do? You're laying around your foster home and you're going to get in a little trouble in and out. But certainly for me, it was a big eye-opener because when I took him to get evaluated and see if we could get him into special ed, he was awfully bright. And I think, oh boy, are we going to have a shot here? Because you can get him back into school if it's disability related. And the evaluator said to us, forget all these sort of silly diagnoses that he got in the juvenile justice system, conduct disorder, oppositional defiant disorder. The child has PTSD. And he had, of course, when I went in to look at the record with that perspective, and I understood that he had been in removed from his home for neglect, but then put with an abusive foster parent who had beaten up his mother. Nobody paid attention to that and had been in jail for it, but then he wanted to reunite family, so he's with the man who is beating him up, and he's running away. And so he gets plopped back in Boston from Georgia, and not in Boston, but a town in Massachusetts, and he's fighting. And so she explained that, you could have heard a pin drop at that hearing with the hearing officer, and she explained, no, this was really PTSD, here's why he did it. And we saw the power of understanding why, what happens to people when they understand better why a child might engage in that behavior. And the hearing officer was angry and ordered him into a beautiful placement. And out comes this wonderful young man who's very bright and lovely, a good man. He contacted me recently as a little baby and was very grateful for getting back into school. Well, what a waste without it. And then came, we have to, in the clinic, we got the call with the 4-year-old who was suspended for crawling out of the classroom. And we go in and said, what is this? A 4-year-old's now getting suspended. And we go in, a student and I went in and, they read out the writ. And he had crawled out of the classroom. He couldn't deny that, and no one was there, and he would freely admit it. But of course, you look in his history, and they were living in a battered women's shelter. They just escaped from a father who had shot up the car, and a lot of stories, sexual abuse of him. And once we helped people understand what was going on, we saw a different way of looking at the child. So I work in the in the clinic, and having the opportunity to be here and think systemically, the way we do at Mass Advocates for Children and we could do in the clinic, we begin to say, okay, we better step back. Like, what do you begin to do? You're seeing a 5-year-old, 4-year-old on his way to the prison. It was just absurd, right? Police had gotten involved in everything there too. And well, what do you do? So the first thing we did was step back, and we're at the academy. We read the research, right? And there's a study called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. Have people heard of this study? I see some yeses, great. And maybe not. Very quickly, it was a study of 17,000 people in very middle class backgrounds at Kaiser Permanente in San Diego, and they asked 17,000 people questions about what their experiences were as a child. And so we don't want to take time there, because our issue isn't to, upset everybody with statistics, but these are pretty horrifying statistics. So I'd like to look at it for themselves. And you hear 1 in 5 people said that they were sexually abused as children. And we've learned since 1 in 4 women, 1 in 5 men, actually is what it pans out to be. But that you have almost 30% of the people said they were physically abused, psychologically abused, so forth. And then 1 in 12 people said their mother was treated violently by her partner. These are not small numbers when you play them out across the country. The study's been played out over and over and over again. So we saw this was a big problem, and meant there were children in every classroom who were experiencing these sorts of things. So we had to look then, of course, here's this, the study said at least 50% had one ACE. So we had to start looking at the issue of the impact of these adverse experiences on children, and that's a phenomenon called trauma. Trauma is not the experience itself, it's a reaction to an event. And this is one of the important issues to keep in mind as we'll start to talk about policy around this and what we need to be doing, because if it's not the event itself, but how you react, and then you learn from the research that it has a lot to do with how you react might relate to your place in the family, gender, who is there to protect you, who wasn't there to protect you, genetic predispositions. The research is incredible, but what it's saying is no 2 children, even in the same family, are going to react the same way. So we can't have a one-shoe-fits-all policy response here. This is it's going to require something much more complex. And then what do we learn from all the neurobiology research? Interestingly, we found all the research, but for us as people working in education, it fell into 3 categories. That the impact of trauma could affect learning. We're seeing learning disabilities, issues around executive functioning, the processing of language. That's big, because you've heard the adage, too scared to speak. It's quite real, because the brain, there's research saying that Broca's region, which is the part of the speech brain, can actually shrink when people are in fear. Relationships, critical to learning, absolutely critical to learning. are going to be affected because trust is affected. And if a child doesn't feel trusting with an adult, they may, find it very hard to have a relationship. And yet in education, relationship is everything, right? Relationship with the teacher, making friends, critical to learning, and of course behavior. Everyone connects it to behavior, but not only aggressive behavior. It can be perfectionism behavior. A child wanting to be so perfect to please someone that they'd rather act out and get in trouble than get caught not being perfect. Couldn't get that paper done, couldn't focus. So here we have two parts to the problem, which is there are a lot of kids, A and B. It's playing a huge role in what's going on in school. And as we started, learn from doing our cases, how much it helped a pathway to entering the juvenile justice system and then onward and upward. So here's what the big policy issue comes for us. We don't focus so much on ACEs or the neurobiology. That does tell us the problem, but it's really about a misunderstanding that's going on. And the policy needs to correct that misunderstanding. And so here's our slide. This is the student perspective and adult perspective. If you've ever worked in schools, it's very common, what the adults will say, well, he's just not paying attention. And the child's frightened. Doesn't feel safe. If I'm perfect, I'll protect myself. Well, that's the good candidate, often the valedictorian. I have to be in control is a big issue with trauma, but that can come across as defiant and aggressive. So, think about that with this young lady with the cell phone. We just don't know what was going on. And in most of these cases, we're not going to know. And what we found is you don't need to know when you start to think at the policy level. It isn't about entering into exactly what happened. It's how are you doing today and what can we help you do to overcome these experiences and go on to be successful just like everyone else, just like the young man who had been out of school, who turned out to be a kind of a star. So our next part of the agenda here is to really move on to the kinds of solutions that, again, we learned about from research and experience in working in schools and what we pursued. So I'm going to turn that over to Michael.
So if you take some of the pieces that we've been hearing about and put them all together, the prevalence of adverse experiences, the impacts that those experiences can have on kids, and the misunderstanding that often happens in schools when educators respond to the challenges that kids might be exhibiting, you can see that in almost any situation where a student is engaging in aggressive or defiant or resistant behavior at school, it at least makes sense to have on educators' minds a question: could something have happened to this young person that is contributing to the way that they're behaving in school? And so certainly this is the question that we hope to put in educators' minds in the individual cases that we do in the clinic. But we're very aware that simply doing the small number of cases we're able to do in our little clinic here at Harvard Law School is not going to solve this problem systemically. It is a great way to learn about what the systemic problem is, because we have the opportunity to learn from the experiences of some of our most vulnerable kids and families here in Massachusetts and the problems that they're encountering in school. But simply doing this small number of cases is not going to be a systemic solution. So as lawyers who want to fix this problem for everybody, not just the kids who are fortunate enough to be represented by our clinic, we had to start thinking about how we could change the education system writ large. And we came upon a very important piece of research that has helped guide us in our thinking about how to do this. There's a famous psychiatrist right here in Cambridge. She works at Cambridge Health Alliance. She's faculty at Harvard Medical School. Her name is Dr. Mary Harvey, and she's the founder and director of a program called the Victims of Violence Program. And one of the things that she and her colleagues have learned in this program is that the way that you help an individual overcome some of the debilitating symptoms from their traumatic experiences, some of the impacts that were on that slide with the Venn diagram that Susan shared with you, are to surround them by supportive communities, to surround them by supportive social contexts. It's not just anymore about giving someone some talk therapy or giving them a mental health service. That might be very helpful, but if they're in a social context that doesn't understand them, it's going to be very hard to overcome the symptomatology that comes from their traumatic experiences. So she has coined a term that we found very useful in our work. It's called ecological fit. Ecological fit has to do with the fit between the person and their social context. Does their social context understand them and understand the behaviors or the challenges they might be experiencing? And there's a quote that understands this, or that helps us understand this. She says, interventions that achieve ecological fit, which is a good thing, are those that enhance the environment-person relationship, i.e. that reduce isolation, foster social competence, support positive coping, and promote belongingness in relevant social contexts. Well, for kids, what is their most relevant social context? It's school. Other than their family, school is the place where they are most of the time. And so when we came upon this work, what it said to us is, we've got to change the social context at school. If this misunderstanding is happening throughout schools and throughout the education system, how can we help schools become social contexts where there's a better ecological fit for kids? And so we do that by focusing on the issue of school culture, helping schools understand the needs that these kids are bringing to the table and respond to the needs of them. The first thing we did at the policy level was we had the impulse to go and share this information with our state legislators. And they had the good wisdom to say, let's throw a little money at this. Not a lot of money because we don't fully understand yet what the solution is, but let's do some experimenting here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So they created a grant program. They said the best way to figure out how to create these social contexts in schools is to let educators experiment with how to do it. And so they created a small bucket of money, and there were some initial innovative school leaders, school principals that applied to get that money and to experiment with approaches of creating social contexts that respond to the needs of traumatized kids. We would call them trauma-sensitive schools. And one of the things that we learned from those early innovative school leaders was that creating these social contexts is really about infusing a sense of safety into every single thing the school does. They taught us to focus on what the operational functions of the school are, the role of leadership, the role of professional development for educators and support personnel, the role of access to services, clinical services often, to support the needs of kids and to be there for educators to consult with, to have a better understanding. The need to infuse this throughout the classroom approaches that teachers are actually using as part of the teaching and learning process. The need to rethink all of the policies and procedures of the school from the standpoint of how might this policy be playing a role in persisting this misunderstanding of kids. And finally, families. Families need to be a part of this process. An understanding of what families are dealing with and infusing a sense of safety into building relationships with families needs to be part of the picture. So the educators helped us learn a lot about what it means to create these kinds of social contexts in school. And so what I thought it would be interesting for us to do is to think back to that video that we saw of the student being flipped in the desk. Now we just saw 30 seconds of that child's life and the life of that classroom. But I think if we step back and think about that video from the standpoint of ecological fit, we can imagine what might have been some of the structural or cultural factors in that school that were creating the lack of ecological fit, a lack of understanding about what might have been going on for that young woman, why she held onto her cell phone, why she wouldn't comply with the instruction that she was being given, and whether or not there was a sense of safety being engendered in that classroom, not just for her, but for the other students who are watching this thing go down. How do you go back to the math lesson when this has just happened? How do you ever trust the adults in your school again after you've seen something like this? Particularly given some of the other dynamics that are obviously going on there, which are dynamics about race, dynamics about gender, probably dynamics about social class and other things. So we can imagine what might have been going on in that school to create the lack of ecological fit. but we can also use this concept of ecological fit to think hopefully, in a hopeful way, about how schools could do something different. So we're going to show you another video now. We're going to sort of turn the tables a little bit and show what it can look like when schools work really hard to create this sense of safety and infuse it throughout everything that they do. This is a video of a school in Brockton, Massachusetts that we've worked with for many years, and it's one of these innovative schools that has helped us learn what it means to create a sense of safety and how to change the culture of the school building. It's an elementary school called the Mary E. Baker School. This is about a 10-minute video clip, and this will give you a sense of the work that we're trying to get happening out there in schools across the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and across the country. Okay, so up to this point, we've been doing a lot of talking. We want to give you a chance to do some talking. We have some discussion questions that occurred to us, but really we'd like you to talk about anything that jumps out at you from that video or the earlier video. Just spend a few minutes turning to your neighbor or the people around you. We want to give you a chance to react to what you've heard and what you've seen so far. So these are some of the questions that you might consider discussing. How would you describe the culture that you just witnessed in the Baker School? What did you observe that jumped out at you? What made an impression on you that the educators are doing in this school? Also, how might staff at the Baker School react to a situation like the one in the first video, where a student is refusing to be compliant? Hard to imagine much flipping of desks at the Baker School. But spend a few minutes just talking about what impressions you have from either video and from the things that you've heard so far. And then we'll come back together. So I'm going to turn it over to Susan and let her address this question that seems to be on many people's minds, which is how do we affect this systemically through law and policy?
I want to thank you very much for these questions about truancy, about outcome scaling, and MCAS. You're just hitting at the core. So we know we're in a room that is willing to look at the complexity with us. If we try solutions that are just too simple, like a program here, with the publisher's instructions, are we really going to get to a trauma-sensitive school like what we saw there? Or do we need something much more complex in terms of supporting, what conditions can we put in law and policy to foster, to enable schools to create environments like this? We have seen, certainly all over our state, the desire to do it by the leaders. And I don't know your name, sir, but what you said, we have heard in focus groups all over the state from our own superintendents and our school committee leadership that DESE, Department of Elementary and Secondary Ed, this is all fine. You're now sort of supporting this because the clinic got a law passed and sort of make you do it. But when you come in, when we drop our test scores for 2 seconds, you're in there hitting on us and you're not mentioning safe and supportive schools as, a way to address the problem at all. So how are we really going to get there when we have this incredible barrier? And I know that everyone's looking for outcomes to scale it up. But I mean, there are spotlights with outcomes. For some reason, that doesn't seem to be enough. And we have our demo schools. On the truancy issue, an issue like that, kids not coming to school, and you look at it in a structural way, what we've also seen in our demo schools, a lot of it is reaching out to parents. Parents not feeling welcome, and children, and then not necessarily supporting their kids to come to school and be on time. They have to be brought in too. So this is about a whole infrastructure of support. And when we start to think about an infrastructure of support to create this environment, the famous researcher Michael Fulton said, you've got to work at 3 levels. You've got to work at the state level, the district level, and the school level. We've got to put structures and support, in place to do that. And so the clinic's been working, we're working in schools to try to share. We're working with, certainly the district of Brockton. We see the power when a district takes it on. And the reason this school has had the support and they've sustained it, the Baker School, for so many years, and then there are other schools in Brockton doing it, is because you notice the superintendent was on the video speaking about this, and then all the academic deans, they had support from the top down and the imprimatur to do it. But then you reach the state and you see, woof, you know, and you sit in rooms where the statements, the DESI are stating, I don't know how they can get off the DESI is Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. You know, I don't know how they can get off the floor after listening to the anger for some of the high-level people in our state who are saying, stop doing this. So what do? We are the clinic, and we do have Harvard resources and feel the honor and obligation not just to do cases. And we've had very great success in our cases, and we're getting some amazing graduates doing wonderful work, like Seth and Amanda. We're so pleased. But, okay, so how do we even think about it, right? Well, of course, we started off by passing, we didn't pass the laws, so we advocated successfully for some laws. So I want to just sort of walk you through the safe and supported school law that our clinic students worked so hard to get passed. And then let's talk about whether this law can help us address some of the court issues that have been raised. We made a decision that we would work deeply in Massachusetts before we went nationwide. We've been called to the White House to talk about policy. You know, people are hungry for it. I mean, the former White House. I guess it was already a year ago. We were called to the White House to talk about this law. And so there's the issue of even implementation at the statewide level to support schools to do this. But then how do you even think at the national level? It's another, and we're getting calls from Kathleen Clark's office wanting to know, at least we've able to draft some bills. We don't know what we go through, but would we help? So, so let's just start by talking about this law, and then let's just have a discussion about where we're getting. Right, so this was Governor Deval Patrick signing the Safe and Supported Schools Framework Statute. And it was a statute that grew out of our work, and if you know, the two books we have here are, which everybody can go on our website, you'll see the sort of theory behind the laws and how our students over the years advocated for many remedies to build up to a big omnibus law. This is called the Safe and Supportive Schools Framework. So what is it? All right. First of all, it starts with a definition of a safe and supportive school. We didn't put up all the words there, but it's a two-part definition. One is defining what whole child is. You know, this is about supporting the whole child, right? Helping them with their relationships, with their self-regulation skills, with their academic competence, because academics is critical to helping children overcome adversity and go on to be successful. But you know, the other pieces have to fit together, and of course supporting their health and well-being. So that's now in statute. And then the second part of the definition is that it's a school that can align all the initiatives. And what that means is, you know, I don't want to take too much time, but we have what's been often called Christmas tree schools, where so many programs are being thrown at schools, and you must follow by fidelity, you must do this, so you have your bullying person over here, and your truancy person over here, and nothing comes together. And then if you look at trauma theory, they're really kids who are needing of support and relationships and connectivity. All of these values are really critical. So we try to embody those kind of values in the definition. So, but it's, again, just a definition. It doesn't mean it's going to be implemented. And now, the commission established a Safe and Supportive Schools Commission, and we were elected co-chairs. So that was a new step for an advocate, right? Because normally we're on the outside pushing in. But I agreed to co-chair with the commissioner, this designee, this commission that would oversee, and it's got all the associations on it, school committees, superintendents, teachers, unions, and so forth. And, you know, what can we do together? There's a grant program where we can try out things. I'm waiting for the framework to come up. Okay, all right, yes, okay. It's here. So, in the structure of the law, that law is MGL Chapter 69 1P. It's part of our Reform Act now. But what it tries to do is provide this infrastructure to have the department support a community of practice. That a lot of this work is going to grow from schools, learning from schools, from the baker, sharing with another school, and spreading out. And so one thing, there are going to need to be tools to do this. So one is the law calls for developing a statewide framework. But it's a framework that's based on whole school approaches. Mike talked to you about the elements of school operations. In other words, it's a framework based on the way educators think, which is what does leadership need to do? What do I need to do at the professional learning level? What do I need to do to access services? What kind of policies and procedures do I need to put in place? And how am I going to engage families? Now, typically, the programs that are thrown out are more of these how-to. You follow my step-by-step here to do your PBIS, and you follow your step-by-step here to do your SEL, and they don't necessarily come together. They're all good, but you need social emotional learning and you need positive behavior. So how do you bring it together? So this is a framework based on school operations designed to integrate, to help schools integrate those many wonderful initiatives, but not be so driven by them. And so the framework is in development. It's going to be a self-assessment tool that schools can use to assess where they're at in terms of transforming school culture. It's being developed. There sounds like there's a lot of expertise in this room, and the commission could really use your help. DESE, it's taken us a while, and we're in there, but we're right in there. Like, again, different for us. But you are able to get a lot of things done when you're sort of in there, because the statute called for conferences and regional trainings, and it took a while to get the department moving, but they did hold the first Safe and Supported School Conference last spring. And they're going to build up to one next year, and they're going to hold regional trainings, and they've invited the clinic to help with developing guidances for using the tool that involve supporting, how a school can go about using an inquiry-based process. Technical assistance and a website. So these are the things that are in the law. But what's hard to put in a law are kind of the values that you saw in the video, right? How do you get that that connectivity that you saw up there? Can you mandate it? Can you order it? Can you put the structure in place? But how do you make the rest of that happen? So certainly what we've learned from working in the demo schools is that if people take actions that are in conformance with the values of a trauma-sensitive school, it kind of holds them, it just holds them in line. It's a wonderful thing. So if you're saying, well, we want to set up morning meetings and that we're going to connect students that way, you say, well, will that connect? Well, will that help kids connect to the community? Will it help students form relationships? Will it be so exciting kids will want to come to school? Will it include parents so they want to get their kids to school? We're asking them, and we're trying to work with the department to incorporate these kinds of values so that we can make what's an infrastructure, wonky sounding thing, actually feel real to teachers. And so I'll just tell you some of the work of the commission that's going on, and then just sort of open it up for your thoughts. Does this even begin to address your questions and other thoughts for us? But what I wanted to say is in developing the framework, we set up committees of people who had expertise in all these different initiatives: social emotional learning, positive behavior, and what are all of them? Equity,
Bullying prevention.
Bullying prevention.
Substance abuse prevention.
Right. And the reason the law kind of says we want you to bring all these together is because the legislature just been getting inundated from the superintendent saying we stop throwing in new initiatives at us every year. You know, last year was your bullying, now it's your truancy law. None of it's pulling together into a whole school to support a whole child. So in order, we were asked to address that issue. And so Ann chaired actually the groups that looked at each one of these initiatives in a really deep way, interviewed experts all over the country from Sugai to CAST. These are, you know, the people that do social emotional learning, and then looked for what are the core values that run through all of them. And out of it came about 10 questions, you know? And out of every single initiative, whether it was from the mouth of the head of PBIS to the head of the people who do social emotional learning, they start with safety. All of them say children have to feel safe in order either to form relationships or to calm down. So there you begin to have a conversation going. They say children have to feel connected. That flowed through every initiative there was. Same with bullying, right? And substance abuse was another one where we did interviews around the country with super experts, and they were saying the same thing. It was safety, connectivity, supporting children to have relationships. Because when you think about equity, for example, it's a really tough one, but I mean, it's about having a relationship with a teacher that's not impeded by barriers that are unkind, cruel, and, you know, full of implicit bias, right? So we began to see that there were certain values that, and once we go to values, and while, you know, we sort of are asking, maybe we should amend the law to put values in it, I don't know. It's something for you all to tell us, but at least in this framework and tool, where I have to end. We're working with the department so that as people engage in the tool and look across their infrastructure about how they can make their environment safe and supportive, they're asking themselves, will it accomplish this goal? Will it increase teamwork among the staff? Because that's one thing this whole thing. So I would like to turn it over to questions and discussion of